Hi, everyone. My name is Siddhartha Maram. I'm a second year PhD student with the University of California, Santa Cruz. I work at the Game User Intelligence and Interaction Lab under the guidance of Dr. Maggie Saif Al Nazir. Thank you for joining us today for this paper presentation. The title of this paper is AstraVerse, where we fundamentally establish a framework which helps you, sensitively borrow elements from mythology into media artifacts, and more specifically, video games. The co-authors of this paper are Johannes Fau, who is a postdoc in the GUI lab, Reza Habibi, a second-year PhD student with the GUI lab, Maggie Saif Al Nazir, the head of the GUI lab and also chair of our department, the computational media department at UC Santa Cruz. As we go in, we would really like to talk about what really motivated us to work on this problem, where do we stand with respect to previous work, and finally diving into the framework and talking about the results, how effective this framework was. Awesome. So moving on, the motivation really behind this particular project is we've been seeing there's an increasing tendency of developing no-code solutions, especially in video game domain, where the bottleneck has started shifting towards creativity, where designers are expected to create new narratives, new characters at a greater pace, and we've seen this game design as a field become more agile in nature, where you want to have the feeling of build, break, and build again, right? So how are we stepping up to kind of augment the ability of designers to design better characters, better narratives, right? Designers have often used mythology as a pool of inspiration to develop characters and narratives. And in this process, what has happened is a lot of designers have transplanted gods from myths, cultures, religions, and other active religions into games. And this possibly led to two major problems, right? Every religion or has a certain number of gods, and how many it creates a pragmatic upper cap in terms of the number of characters you can borrow into the game. Second, especially when you're in revolving around active religions, you receive a lot of religious and cultural backlash from groups who are not really comfortable with having people they worship or gods they worship in video games, right? So that is where we see the problem coming in, and we want to step up and say, hey, here is a framework you can use, and follow this process, and you might be able to develop culturally sensitive characters without the need of transplanting gods. So how do we stand with respect to other work in this field, right? So we majorly look at two bodies of work. Well, the first one is we're trying to understand the position of religion, theology, culture, and gaming. How are they moving hand in hand? So academic HCI did spend a lot of time in trying to understand how players feel when they see religious entities, or the perception of players when they see culturally identifiable or relatable entities in video games. But I think on the flip side, there has been very less discussion on how the whole culture, religion, and mythology as a space can act as a design space for developing new artifacts instead of just copying them, right? So this is where we want to deviate from existing literature and say that, hey, this is a study where we explore religious artifacts, the scriptures, and see how this can inspire a design space at the same time being novel and yet culturally sensitive. And the other set of body of work which we're trying to look at is trying to study design spaces and taxonomies for games, right? Researchers have worked on developing design protocols, rules, and a set of mechanics in which you can build serious games or games for health, or different genres of games. But how this has been built is like you go through an existing set of games, and then you identify these mechanics. But we do the vice versa here. Like, we don't look at games, but instead we look at scriptures, we look at material, and then see what can this material offer you for you in your games. How can this material help designers come up with new mechanics, new narratives, new characters, and whatnot, right? So that is where we position ourselves. So we had a set of motivations, to build this is where the current work is, and then we raise our hand and say, hey, follow this framework, or use this framework, and you might be able to develop sensitive characters still which are relatable, novel, and engaging as an experience. So bottom line, video game characters need to be creative, but yet they need to be sensitive as such, because it is important you respect beliefs of people and not offend people who actually practice particular cultures, mythologies, or religions. Okay, that's it. Let's actually dive into the core of this paper, which is the framework itself. So first steps, this framework is divided into three steps. Step number one is mythological derivation. Step number two is a generative step. And step number three is literally evaluating what you've done so far. So the mythological derivation is where you actually go through, we use discourse analysis as a research method, and we go through elements we go through scriptures, we go through comics, we go through videos, and we go through different available material on a particular belief set of beliefs, and then we try to create a tabular taxonomy in terms of what this particular belief system can help in developing new game mechanics. So once we have this tabular taxonomy, we try to create new characters. So we have a participatory design workshop where we kind of invite people to create new characters using this taxonomy. Cool. Now we have new characters developed, and how are they novel? How are they culturally sensitive? This is where we kind of have an evaluative step, right? So what I'll do now is I'll go through each of these steps and parallelly give you an example of how we have applied this particular framework on a very active religion, which is Hinduism, right? The choice of really choosing Hinduism was because we have seen a lot of articles where religious groups have been offended by how certain games have portrayed certain characters across these games, right? So the first step, mythological derivation, we want to see how each character, or at least certain characters in a particular mythology or a culture, can give granular game mechanics. Like, for example, if you look at the on the right side of my screen, what you would see is you see this eagle-based character in Hindu mythology called Garuda, who has a human torso and eagle-like wings with a large wingspan. So when I talk about things like human torso and eagle-like structure or great speed, these are the mechanics we really want designers to use rather than using the character himself, right? So this is where we step in and we're trying to break down the character into the mechanics they offer rather than just copy pasting the character, right? So we also give a tidbit about the narrative in case that acts as inspiration to develop new narratives. So yeah, so we went to religious texts, YouTube videos, internet pages, Reddit basically, and to identify different gods and then make some granular, kind of split that particular deity or into the granular elements they offer, which designers can borrow, right? This was the first step, and this is easily applicable to any other mythology. Like you could do Egyptian mythology, you could do Greek mythology, or it could be an ancient mythology which nobody even practices these days. So that's how this step is situated. The next step is the generative step. While with the tabular taxonomy we have established in the previous step, we invited a set of designers, amateur designers basically, who are starting their careers in design, who are graduating from the UCSC's master's degree in game design game program, and none of these participants really identified as Hindus, and one of them being quite familiar with it, just familiar with the mythology. So what we did is we gave this tabular taxonomy and said, hey, can you generate new characters, and can you talk about what kind of narrative you would envision these characters taking a role in, right? So with that step, the characters, the designers started building characters, and we go to the more colorful part of this presentation where you actually see some really fun characters, right? So the three participants, P1, P2, P3, and each of them kind of is describing their character here. So participant one talks about how he envisions a female antagonist. He talks about having three heads. Now this three heads is again, he, as the participant quotes, is inspired from the table of taxonomy where there's a particular character with 10 heads, right? And similarly they say that they want to empower their character with nature powers, which are similar to another character in the taxonomy. Participant two, what I really like about this character is that it is inspired from the taxonomy itself, where they have multiple hands, and the genre of weapon system they use are the musical instruments from that particular taxonomy. Another thing which we can really talk about is the character will unlock more arms and weapons as the level progresses, and this is where we want to lay an emphasis on the self-sufficiency of this taxonomy, right? You don't just want to create one character, you want to create characters which evolve with time and temporally as the game progresses, and this is where we think about it. And even in the first example, you're not just creating protagonists, but you're creating antagonists also, right? And finally, the final character, again, the participant has some quotations from the taxonomy, and they talk about using a mutable moon which controls tides, and also because the moon's gravitational pull controlling tides, and also the same moon acting as a sword. So how they're using different elements from space and a system of magical elements into the character itself, right? So moving on, the narrative in which these characters are placed according to the participants are, though the first participant drew they talked about envision the antagonist, but the protagonist, they assume that the whole setting is set up in a modern era where an ancient demon has come up, and then you are equipped with new celestial weapons from the taxonomy, and you're fighting in a modern world with celestial weapons. Well, participant two, really interesting here. They talk about colonialism and how the character they generated uses music as a genre to free their people, free their tribe from colonialism as such. Participant three, they are very related to nature, and they want to talk about climate change, and they want to equip their character with climate powers which revolve around weather and climate, so that they can players can envision the effect and the destruction climate can actually cause, right, when not treated properly. That said, now we want to really evaluate. The final step is like evaluate these characters based on novelty and how sensitive they are towards culturally, right? So the first step is creativity, where we fall back to the Brookert creative rubric, which is a set of prompts which you can rate on the scale of 0 to 5. 1 to 5 basically, and we recruited two senior designers to kind of talk about the prompts and also rate them. The problem with quantitative evaluation is that we don't have a benchmark established saying that, hey, these characters are more creative than a particular character, right? So that's why we also take a qualitative approach. So you can see on this table here that, okay, they're on the upper side on a scale of 1 to 5, but what we really wanted to stress on is what they talk about qualitatively, right? What they talk about these characters qualitatively and how they compare against each other. So Judge 1 says that he's really fascinated with the whole concept of musical warfare against something so relatable like colonialism, while they were a little critical on the first character, where both the parties, the antagonist and the protagonist, had mythical powers. So yeah, you can see how the taxonomy drives the discussion, the being interested in musical warfare, or having multiple heads or two mythological characters fighting in a modern day world, right? And none of these are like transplanted from Hindu mythology. These are not gods these are not gods which you can find in a particular mythology. Judge 2 talks about how they really like the concept of mutable moon, and that controlling the weather. The mutable moon is actually a weapon from the taxonomy itself, while it's used as a sword. So this is what we wanted to show, like how there is an emphasis on borrowing elements from mythology, and the judges being able to recognize it and appreciate it. For the sensitivity part, we recruited 39 students from an Indian online communities at UCSC, and the participants were 92% were Hindus, and 3.6 were atheists, 3.6 were Jains. And what we did here is we gave a benchmarking character. This is Kali from the game Smite, and then the other three characters which the participants generated, and they were asked to talk about did they find it offending, or did they find it perfectly normal, or maybe they were just like a little iffy about it, they were not comfortable with it, or do they know someone who would be offended with such a representation even though they're okay with it, because we wanted to we wanted to understand the pulse here, like what's the pulse of people appreciating or able to relate with the character. So as you can see, the numbers are pretty clear here. When you look at the Kali Smite one, right, so only 10% of the participants felt it was normal, while they knew at least 53% of people who might have 53% of the people acknowledge the fact that they do know someone who might be offended by it, while the numbers kind of flip when you talk about the characters generated by the participants, where they were found more normal and very less in terms of how other people would be offended with it, right? So I think when we actually had a prompt where they could actually talk about, really write about what they felt about these characters, you can see people claiming that they're taking references from the mythology, and these people do not even know what's the taxonomy as such. They're absolutely clueless on why we're showing these characters, but still they're able to kind of relate it to Hindu mythology and kind of talk about elements which they know from their experiences, and they also claim it's more artistic rather than offensive as such, right? Just a quick recap, just to stitch things together. So we had a 3-step framework. Step number 1 is mythological derivation. So we had this tabular taxonomy. Step number 2 is this generative step, where participants were creating characters, and the step number 3 was an evaluative step, where we're kind of comparing it both on the sensitivity and the creative aspect of it. So I think there's certain drawbacks which we want to address in this future work, right? Like, for example, evaluating these characters in the next set of work, we want to evaluate it actually with experts in this theology and mythology, like having priests or having people who are in this state of decision making power to come and evaluate these characters. The current taxonomy is very tabular in nature, so you have to like literally go through each of the rows. But instead, we want to create like a character creation interface and see how that results in creating characters, right? And we want to use more HCI practices such as ethnography and grounded theory to actually develop the taxonomy to make it more graphical rather than a tabular based. We also want to explore like if there are quantitative frameworks which can kind of talk about evaluating creativity, acceptability, and sensitivity, because currently it's a lot qualitative driven study, right? Not just Hindu mythology, we want to like go through different demographics and different design spaces and see what kind of new characters that would result in. Yeah, but that's all for now, and thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I might not be available to take your questions in person, but I'm absolutely happy to connect, discuss, and have multiple conversations. I'm very, very responsive, both on email as well as on Twitter. So thank you so much.